Hi folks, and welcome to Grumpy Opinions. Yep, you might have noticed there's a little bit of a change in look on this, but generally, it's going to be the same setup as it has been the last few years. I might continue to make a few little changes here or there to the visual side or maybe the sound side of the videos, but otherwise, the Movies by Month is here to stay. So let's get kicked off with a new year with the films I saw in January of 2022. So like a lot of the tail end of last year, I didn't get an awful lot of chance to hit the cinemas, but I did get to see one movie this January, and that being the surprisingly unexpected sequel to the Matrix trilogy, The Matrix Resurrections. Yes, this legacy sequel, that's what they call it, finds Thomas Anderson as a much older man working as a games developer at a big Warner Brothers owned game company. They literally mention this in the movie. How meta. And he's famous for writing the Matrix trilogy. How meta. But now Warner Brothers want a reboot sequel. How meta. Only this gives him a massive amount of anxiety, and into the mix suddenly a brand new Morpheus and a girl named Bug appears, and they want to free him from the Matrix, only he wants to now rescue Trinity, who is a woman called Tiffany, and is basically... Look, this is exactly the same as The Matrix. If you've seen that film, then you basically know exactly the plot. I mean, aside from a lengthy musical montage sequence of him and a bunch of other games devs talking about the new Matrix game and how they're going to make it and all the stuff they want to throw into it, the rest of this is about as cut and paste scenes from The Matrix or the sequels, but with the characters addressing pretty much almost to the camera that this is the same thing over again. Now, it's not terrible. Apart from the fist fights, which aren't a patch on the old movies, I mean, the choreography's messy and incomprehensibly shot for the most part, and it's all leaps and bounds below the clean, easily comprehensible stuff from the earlier movies, which is really well done. And at the end of the day, this sadly, it's kind of a poor waste of a franchise follow-up, and it has the distinct tinge of being made by people who really didn't want to make it, but also didn't want anyone else to make it either. So, 2 out of 5. Unless you're really morbidly curious, or a complete Matrix aficionado who's desperate to see every part of it, then this is one that you probably ought to just skip and rewatch the original trilogy again, because even the worst parts of that are probably better than this. And now on to the films I watched at home, or on streaming, or on Blu-ray. As I've said before, it's kind of important to start the year with a good film, and this year, that being 2022, I've pretty much managed well with Il Postino, or The Postman. No, not that, The Postman. This isn't a post-apocalyptic Kevin Costner movie. This is a delightful wee Italian film set on a small island in the Mediterranean just after World War II, where a lonely middle-aged fisherman's son is desperately sad and listless and takes a job delivering mail to the poet Pablo Neruda, who's staying on the island during his exile from Chile. And this is a sweet little story all about these two men becoming friends, and the old poet teaching the younger man how to woo the beautiful barmaid in the town. And yes, it's sentimental, but it's also a beautifully shot film with great performances, especially from Massimo Troisi, who sadly was so ill from heart complications during the making of the film he could only film about an hour a day, and he actually died less than a week after principal photography ended. But still, it's an absolutely beautiful, wonderful story, and it definitely set me up the road for some great films this year. 5 out of 5, check it out and enjoy it. In a completely different vein, I watched Disney's latest musical extravaganza, Encanto. This is a South American story of magic and song, all set in a small village called Colombia, where the family of Bernalda Alba, I mean the family of Abuela live, and every one of them gets a magical power when they reach the puberty. They also get their own room created by the magical house. Only, young Mirabel doesn't get any magic for whatever reason. She just doesn't get given the power and becomes the black sheep of the family. But then one night she sees cracks appear all over the house and starts investigating them, and also the disappearance of her uncle Bruno. We don't talk about Bruno. Enough of that. Anyway, it's a decent enough film with some staggering design and animation, but for me, I thought it actually suffered a little bit from the same problem that Pixar's Brave did, where this is really just a movie with 2 acts. It just sort of stops. And other than that, there's some decent songs, the voice acting's pretty solid, and yeah, it was an okay film, so 3 out of 5. Middling, and you will know forever and ever that we don't talk about Bruno. A very different kind of song though was Swan Song. Now this is an original film on Apple TV, and also the first film on that channel that I've actually reviewed since Greyhound, remember that? Anyway, this is a near-future sci-fi story all about a guy called Cameron. He's a design artist who learns one day that he's got a terminal disease that means that at some point he might drop dead, literally at any minute. Now that's not a really good thing to happen when he's got a young son, his wife's preggers, and the relationship between the two of them has been a bit fraught lately and is only just starting to mend because she had a breakdown a few years earlier after a family tragedy. So instead of just dying and letting everyone feel bad and wishing him well as he goes, Cameron opts for a secret company's offer to replace him with an identical clone. One who's fully healthy, has all of his memories, and once in place, isn't even going to know that he's a clone. Of course, this then leads to all sort of moral and existential dilemmas, and Cameron's own terror at his impending doom, and the fact that he's going to be replaced. And I would say this is a 4 out of 5. I mean, I enjoyed this. It's really beautifully shot. Mahershala Ali and her off 28 Days Later are both really, really great in the movie. And amazingly so is Awkwafina, the woman who played the comedy sidekick in The 10 Rings of Shyamalan and Ding Dong, the MCU film from last year. And it's really an exploration of grief, impending death, and the fears of being replaced, and basically of our own importance in life and what we leave behind. And I'd suggest checking it out on an evening when you're calm and ready for some introspection. I mean, the only downside of the film really is that it did have some issues with it feeling an awful lot similar to other things you've seen before. I mean, I felt an awful lot of Ex Machina here, and it reminded me a lot of some episodes of Black Mirror with similar concepts. But overall, this was still a really good film, and I recommend it. And a film that's been doing the rounds on Prime and Netflix for the last few years that I never got around to watching was Prospect. This is a low-budget indie film based on a short the director made a few years earlier, all set in an alien world where a crap dad and his belligerent daughter are prospectors who dig up alien larva eggs or something that can be used as sort of gemstones if they're treated right. Now, it's a rough world, and after an altercation with some other prospectors, the girl ends up stuck alone and in need of the Mandalorian himself, Pedro Pascal, to try and help her get off-world by cutting a deal with some mercs on the other side of the forest. Now, this is a pretty well-made film. And it's actually got a decent enough budget for what it is. I think it was about 4 million, and yet it uses it in really clever places, you know, creating a world that looks good, but feels lived in, but also at the same time doesn't feel ostentatious. And below the surface, this is kind of a really basic Western script. Now, I mean, you remove the spacesuits and swap alien gems for gold or diamonds, and basically, this is just a script for a cowboy movie. And there's nothing wrong with that at all, and this is a solid 3 out of 5 film. It does an awful lot well, only falling apart a little bit with a few weird moments and a few odd choices where it feels that the filmmakers were maybe a bit too keen to keep things in that sort of Firefly style of things rather than let the space stuff shine through where it probably should have. And as I said, it's a good experience, and Pedro Pascal and newcomer Sophie Thatcher, who you might recognise actually as one of the mod squad off of the Book of Boba Fett. I mean, the pair of them are actually really good in this, spouting off this slightly off-kilter Shakespearean space-age dialogue and conveying a lot with not too much self-awareness. But yeah, Prospect, not a bad film. Okay, so here's a funny one, or not as the case may be. Bo Burnham's Inside is a Netflix special which I wouldn't normally include since I don't usually mention stand-up comedy stuff that I watch, but this technically was a film? Maybe? Basically, this is supposedly, and I say supposedly because one of Burnham's trademark things in his work, aside from repetitive songs, are fourth wall breaking bits of meta-commentary. So essentially, this film is Burnham during the course of the last year, locked up on his own in his apartment during lockdown, getting increasingly weird about the world, and basing songs on the things he's doing, like Skyping his mum, or looking through Instagram, or watching reaction videos on YouTube, and effectively using the making of this special as a kind of coping mechanism while he's stuck in isolation. The trouble is, I didn't actually find it very funny. And it's supposed to be a comedy, and also I didn't think the songs were very good. His songs aren't my kind of thing. I mean, they were fine, but basically he just ends up repeating the same refrain over and over and over again for most of the song, and it just gets a little tiresome. Also, you literally see at the end of the show that actually he's not in his own apartment. It's like a holiday home he's kind of hired, and they shot everything inside that. And a quick Google search reveals that the entire time he was making this, he was actually living in his girlfriend's apartment, and he was going out to this other place to film, pretending that this was the place he was locked down in. So actually none of this is real. Anyway, apparently it resonated with a lot of people and their experiences of lockdown in the last year, and basically the declining mental health of people. But for me, this just wasn't what everything was like. I didn't find Burnham very endearing and or entertaining, and to be honest, I don't think I'm a fan of his style of comedy. So 2 out of 5. I would say this is probably not the best use of your time, but who knows? Your mileage may vary. Another Netflix original that I watched, which was a bit strange, was The House. Now, not to be confused with The House, which is a movie I reviewed last January about a couple turning their home into a casino, or His House, which is some sort of horror movie on Netflix about asylum seekers in London. No, this is The House, an animated stop-motion movie told in 3 parts, all about a weird, spooky house somewhere in Englandshire which is kind of cursed. Now, this is kind of an odd one, because one of the three stories had human characters, but then the second and third ones didn't. I mean, I think they were meant to be humans, but for some reason, all the people were rats or cockroaches in the second story, and the third, they were all cat people. And no, it never makes sense. It doesn't try to explain it. I presume it's not supposed to be a world where animals have taken over. It's just, a decision somebody made. Probably because all three different parts were made by different animators. So yeah, the first tale is a horror movie about a crazy guy building a spooky house and a poor family who moves in and starts to get corrupted and confused by it. The second was a guy trying to sell the property and in sort of modern days and fighting off like loads of cockroaches and other weird stuff. And the third is all about a woman in a sort of post-apocalyptic future trying to run the place as a guest house as floodwaters rise and her non-paying tenants become difficult and start causing her stress. Honestly, I feel like whoever greenlit this clearly just built a big extension, or they just bought a difficult house and had to do it up, and clearly had some kind of deep-rooted issues and anger about it. But to me, this was just a weird and unfortunately increasingly dull movie, where the plots get progressively less interesting and more weird. And unfortunately, the first story, which is kind of the most interesting, felt like it was cut far too short, and could have actually done with being a feature-length film. So, 2 out of 5 for this, because the 2 definitely comes down to the fact that the voice acting's fine, but the stop-motion animation is at times really good. But other than that, this was kind of forgettable nonsense, and I wouldn't waste your time with it. Now, remember last year I mentioned that I'd never actually seen all of The Emperor's New Groove? Well, now I have. This film from way back in 2000 was one of the last few Disney movies that eluded me from their animated back catalogue, and all I knew about this was a very, very basic concept, and that I'd seen maybe the first couple of minutes many, many years ago. And I had no idea what I was in for, because this feels like what you would get if Shane Black had made a Disney movie. I mean, especially with the quirky voiceover, the bonkers jokes, and some of it was really oddly unusual and refreshing. And there's also only 2 songs, like one during the end credits, and no attempt at a romance plot, and some actual characters who aren't your usual Disney sanitized nonsense. And wow, I mean, I'm sure you've already seen this, and if not, watch it, because I know I'm late to the party here, but hey, I mean, I really like this. I'm going to give it a solid 3 out of 5. I mean, not in a bad way, but just because, you know, it's fun, it's good, but it's not really any more than that. But it's a lot more fun and more unusual than your usually Disney stuff, and that makes up for the lack of catchiness or hook-grabbing music. But it is one that I actually reckon I would have liked if I'd seen it a lot earlier, and it's one that I will revisit and I'll maybe enjoy it even more. But yeah, for the moment, definitely, yeah, The Emperor's New Groove is a far better film than I would have ever expected. Next in the ongoing Friday film night madness was a thriller called Deception. Now, Deception's a strange film indeed. This thriller in the art world where a strangely reclusive woman seeks out master auctioneer and occasionally underhanded art swindler Geoffrey Rush, who likes to collect paintings of beautiful women he's naffed off as forgeries even though they actually are real. Anyway, in this plot, the mysterious lass wants him to sell off the contents of her parents' home, only it turns out she secretly lives in a hidden room inside the building, and slowly the pair start to bond. Him, this older germophobic misanthrope, and her, the young, recluse, emotionally crazy woman, and behind it all this brooding love affair, there's Rush finding these pieces of the ancient robo-machine man thing, and is secreting them away to this engineering whiz kid he knows, in return for advice on how to cope and seduce women. And it's a kind of weird movie, a very Italian movie, but not a bad film, solid 3 out of 5. Unfortunately let down slightly by the title, which doesn't really fit the film that well, other than that, ironically, it gives away the ending a little bit. The original Italian title is The Best Offer, which is actually a far better and more fitting name. The film's directed by the same guy who made the very excellent Cinema Paradiso, which is a total gem, and it's probably why it looks so good, despite being a little bit vapid and kind of unclear at points. Honestly, it's kind of a shame that this is an original movie and wasn't a book, because it feels like this is actually an adaptation of a much more complicated and fascinating novel which doesn't exist. But as it stands, you know, as I said, it's a mediocre and enjoyable enough film, but with some issues. Now, this was kind of a random choice, but I watched Eat, Pray, Love, which is a mid-noughties New Yorker-y movie about a woman with a midlife crisis based on a book, and apparently is a true story. It's all about Julia Roberts, who decides she wants a divorce from her loving but kind of vapid and directionless husband, and then after a little fling with James Franco, who's kind of a narcissistic preening young actor, she decides to find herself by going off to Italy to eat food, then India to get into kind of Buddhistic shizzle, and then finally to Bali, where she finds... Okay, no joke, I actually literally only just worked out that that's why this is called Eat, Pray, Love, but that's exactly what happens in each of the film's acts. Anyway, 2 out of 5. because despite a great performance from Tinkerbell, the Undead Pirate Man, and her off Suicide Squad and Dr. Manhattan, this feels like what the wanky self-aggrandizing nonsense that it is, and the voiceover throughout kind of just feels like a slightly less obnoxious Carrie from Sex and the City. Really, I mean, it's that exact same sort of sense of self-importance and style of writing, and maybe the book comes off as a little bit better, but in the film, yeah, this just sounds like a vapid story of a vapid person who, frankly, by the end of it, you really just want to shake and say, get over yourself. Now, one thing that will often save a movie is food porn. It's always an option, sometimes a blessing, and Chef, the movie by and starring Jon Favreau, is really, really good in that regard. Now, this is a story all about Favreau as a divorced chef with a great relationship with his ex-wife, but not particularly with his son, although he also does have a kind of a bit of a fling going with Black Widow on the side, so there you go, you know. Anyway, his job's good, his team's great, but he feels creatively stifled, especially when his boss tells him that he shouldn't make a new fancy menu when a food critic comes to chow down. So he decides, okay, I won't then, and the place gets slated for not being original, leading to him blow up the critic, and the video goes viral, and he ends up losing his job and deciding to buy a food truck and go on the road on a journey, taking it back home from the other side of the country, allowing him to reconnect with his son, who comes along for the ride and starts to learn some of the family business. And this is a really sweet, nice film. I mean, it's also going to make you really, really hungry if you haven't eaten while you're watching it. And I'll say this up front, I actually really enjoyed this film. It's a 4 out of 5. I did feel I was let down slightly by the very, very end of the movie, which kind of rips off another movie in a similar vein about chefs and kitchens, but also feels like far too nice and neat a bow to tie up on the end of a film that, to be honest, had a good enough ending as it was going. So really, I mean, this is a feel-good movie with a great message. It's all about food, family and fun, so not bad at all. Worth checking out despite that. So that was January, and while I have to admit that it was a pretty busy month when it came to films, I also will have to admit that February and March have not been anywhere near as busy as that, which I can still only apologise that it's taken me this long to actually get a video up for this, but I've been crazy busy with work, and most recently I've actually been busy with my Outlander reviews, so if you're not watching those, maybe check them out. If you are watching those, maybe check out these videos, which you would have to be watching to hear me say this. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I will try and get the February video up soon. It won't be anywhere near as long as this, and similarly, as I said with March, it'll be a little bit on the shorter side. Both of those should hopefully be up in pretty good time over the next few weeks. Let's make 2022 a year to enjoy. So keep seeing movies, keep looking after yourselves, and keep coming back to hear my grumpy opinions.